I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know about the news of the day. Now, the water disruption in the Klang Valley, that's dominated headlines over the past weekend. 1.2 million consumer accounts were affected since last Thursday when 4 water treatment plants had to be shut after pollutants were detected in a river. Now, the plants have since resumed operations and supply is being restored in stages. And the Selangor MB, while his strident promise to demolish the offending factory was well received, the tables, however, have turned on him when his wife posted an Instagram story of a water truck at their official residence, as well as some photos of family members in their swimming pool. Now, public outrage followed suit with the presumption that the water was meant for recreational purposes. But both the MB and his wife have apologized, clarifying that the water was not meant for the pool. However, my question is whether it's enough to actually quench the ire of the public. What do you think, Sharaad? Was that enough?
These are troubling times on so many fronts. And I think, Melissa, to have to add to the woes and the misery
and the frustrations,
that we have, right, as a public over so many issues, to add the water problem to it. This is not the consequence of a drought or, we've had torrential downpours. This has to do with something going wrong in the system, right?
Oh, yes.
The system of water management. But coming back to the Menteri Besar Selangor and his particular problems. He's asked the public not to carry on this discussion.
Yes, not to harp on it.
But of course, as we all know, there's no controlling these stories. There's no controlling the way in which bad press travels. It will travel until it needs to travel.
Well, because the optics was so poor. I mean, the optics, the timing. Granted, the wife of the Menteri Besar, Mas Diana Muhammad, has apologized, but I'm not quite sure whether that was enough to kind of undo the damage that was done by the poor optics.
Right. So the question is, are people who are related to politicians, their spouses, their family members, extended family, do they think of themselves as somehow in the same, under the same kind of public scrutiny, the same glare as their partners are? And, and if so, do they need to somehow be counseled in terms of managing their personal, social media accounts, in terms of things they say that might be picked up in a much more public setting?
Are you talking about like public relations training or media training,
Indeed,
what not to do during a crisis?
Absolutely. So there is a crisis. People are going to be unhappy. They're going to want to blame someone. Your partner is in a public office and is likely to be the target of some of that blame. What should you not do?
Okay, well, what about this? The fact that at least there was an apology. Quite forthcoming in the apology. Granted, saying that let's move on and talk about other things. So wanting bad press to go away may not necessarily make bad press go away. But the fact that there was an apology, if you compare that to some politicians who don't even bother apologizing.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, we've had politicians neither apologizing or being honest in their assessments of what's happened. They throw colleagues under the bus. So we've had all manner of responses coming from the political elite. This, of course, I think probably on the positive end of the spectrum in terms of recognizing that the optics of it were just bad, and also I think addressing the questions that are very central to the way the public views what's happening in this country is that the privilege that political elite have. Why was a water truck there specially for the Menteri Besar's house? I mean, so on and so forth.
Definitely. And I do particularly like the point that you made at the start, saying that this is beyond just the issue of public inconvenience. We have to go beyond that. This is actually more than that. It's fundamental. There are institutional issues here, institutional failures here that we need to address. And we're going to come back to the issue of the security of our water resources in just a couple of minutes and address that in the rest of the show. But first, in other news, effective today, long-term pass holders from countries that have recorded more than 150,000 COVID-19 cases, they have been barred from entering Malaysia. Now, the countries include the US, the UK, India, Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, just to name a few. And the ban involves 6 categories of pass holders, and those include the people with permanent resident status, Malaysia My Second Home program participants, and also professional expatriates. Now, also barred are spouses of Malaysian citizens and their children, as well as students from Indonesia, Philippines and India, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Melisa, that's almost every BRIC country
Yes.
in the world. Also, I wonder about Europe. I mean, should Europe be considered as one in this particular move by the government? It left me bewildered because, Melisa, we're not talking
Agreed.
about opening the gates to tourists from all these countries. We're talking about people who have an existing relationship to the country. They have long-term pass holders. How many could there be? And surely, if these are the people who want to cross borders, come back to Malaysia or so on and so forth,
Yes.
surely the existing quarantine and testing regimes are enough
Yes.
to deal with the question of whether they will pose a danger.
Well, isn't that the point of testing and quarantine is to allow people to come in, but you have to observe the SOPs. And I really do wonder, the thinking behind this policy. Was there rationale for picking the 150,000 arbitrary number of cases? Was there an epidemiology thinking behind that figure, picking that number for those countries? And it's really quite interesting to think about whether there was science behind this policy. What are the trade-offs of not having these people being allowed to come into the country versus keeping our borders closed to a certain
on the
degree?
first point that you were making about the science of it, Melissa,
Yes.
it's 150,000 is the absolute number, not relative to the size. So in India with over a billion people versus a country with a smaller population, some countries are so small that they might have a much more chronic situation, but they might not have as many people positive,
Is
right?
it per capita? We're talking about
Indeed.
cases per capita.
Yeah, and also then the question of cases, right? So positive cases, not necessarily people sick, but would be dependent on the testing. Right? So if we look at Malaysia, we don't do massive testing. So then would we, by our own standards, fall short? I mean, would you then say, well, it doesn't matter, so the country doesn't test so much, but they have smaller numbers of positives, we could let them in. So it really bewilders me, this policy, Melissa, but I think we'll hope for more clarity.
Yes.
If journalists are at those press conferences and are allowed to ask more critical questions.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, but after this, we'll take on the issue of the persistent problem of pollution in our water catchment areas. That's all coming up in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to consider this.
Responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene to adhere are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm.
Hi, you're watching Consider This with me, Melisa, Idris and Sharaad Kuttan. Klang Valley's water crisis over the last few days have really highlighted again the issue of water security. Joining us on the show tonight to discuss this further, we have Charles Santiago. He's DAP's Member of Parliament for Klang and also former Chairman of the National Water Services Commission, or better known as SPAN. Charles, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, Charles, you've taken an aim at the Environment and Water Minister, Tuan Ibrahim Tuan Man, but shouldn't the Selangor State Government take the lion's share of the blame for this recent water crisis?
I think the responsibility for water is both with the federal as well as the state. Although the federal government has greater power in terms of enforcement, the Department of Environment comes under the federal government. Selangor has got laws and they can increase the fines. The only thing that Selangor can do is to increase the fines. But I think increasing fines is really not a deterrent. It is necessary, but not sufficient though. I think that we are looking at a problem that has been going on for too long, one that actually needs a major regulatory framework, a new regulatory framework maybe, and maybe an affordable scheduled waste services, including a dedicated agency to manage rivers in the country. So we really need to think out of the box in order to manage the new issues that we are facing in terms of pollution though. But just to give a sense of perspective, in 2018, there were 92 shutdowns in Selangor, and this has got a lot to do with pollution. And in 2019, up till June 2019, there were 25 shutdowns, including partial shutdowns in some parts of the state, but also complete lockdown of the state in terms of water availability.
Sorry,
So
Charles, you said that the 92 shutdowns in 2018, that's not because of pollution?
Pollution is pollution.
Or
related.
because of pollution?
That's right. And then in 2019, it is 25, and it's up to June. And I think some of the problems we had in 2019 were far more serious and far more longer in terms of the time period when you were able to return water back to people. But also to give a sense of the problem that we have, I think we need to understand this problem of pollution in a larger context. Today, our rivers are considered rubbish dump for almost every industry, though. The plastic pollution, we have electronic waste, we have chemicals, including toxic material in the rivers, dumped into the rivers, pesticide, rubbish, husbandry waste. This is pig and chicken waste that's dumped into rivers, and then you have sewage as well. So you can see you're killing the river, and this river gives us 80% of all drinking water for all Malaysians. But what we're doing is we're killing the river slowly, and this is really not helpful on the way forward, given climate change and so on and so forth.
Charles, I do want to, sorry if I can interrupt, come back to the question of who's to blame and jurisdiction. You make it sound like the state of Selangor is limited only to increasing or decreasing fines. What about investing in monitoring systems? What about the fact that, under the Selang Municipal Council, which is responsible for the Sungai Gong pollution incident recently, they seem to have their hands tied because of a legalization process. So the factories alleged to be the responsible are part of some legalization process and could not be shut down. I mean, is the state government and are the municipal councils within the water catchment area so powerless to act?
No, I completely agree with you. This is a case whereby people have slept on the jobs. People have been sleeping. I mean, the Selangor local council, including the state government, has not been doing its work. Clearly, this company did not have, in today's paper, Ranama reports that this company doesn't have a license since 2014. So how did this company operate for the last 6 years? And who was protecting the company? And on top of that, the company was also, fined in March of this year. And interestingly, it is not for affluent spilling into the river of affluent, but it is actually for some other reason. So that means the local council knew exactly the existence of this company, but nothing happened.
Charles, can I jump in? The Selang Municipal Council says that because these companies have been given until the end of the year to be legalized and processed, that they can't in fact act against these factories, that they are held back by a state directive saying that these facilities cannot be demolished.
There is a legalization process in place.
Yeah, but this has been going on for quite a long time. And I think the point is, this is not the only company that is facing the problem. All across this, alongside of the river, you have 34 to 40 different factories that are doing the same thing, including involving lots of chemicals, pesticides, and so on and so forth, including plastics. So there are many of these companies in the state of Selangor as well as in the country. So this is a bigger problem that we have to manage.
Okay,
and that is why I proposed the idea of a national river protection authority, which will actually give buffer between the rivers on both sides of the river, 300, 400 meters. No economic activity can take place in that buffer. And that buffer, including the river, will be perceived as a national security area. And it will be supervised by the police, by the specialized agency, with CCTVs and so on and so forth.
So what's stopping us from this necessary reform, from creating a national river protection authority? Is it cost? Are we talking about a catchment area that is so big that it becomes untenable or not feasible to have a buffer zone?
No, I think it is possible, it is doable, given that we would have lost in the last 3 days at least $1 billion. Shops were closed, factories were closed, people were unable to go to work and all kinds of stuff. We would have lost easily $1 billion. And I think it is definitely possible. What is lacking right now is the political will. We are in this habit of pointing fingers at each other, and nobody wants to take ownership of the problem. And everybody is pointing the finger at each other. So that is why I think we really need to sit down, and I've actually called upon the Ministry of Selangor to form a task force and to come out with a plan of action in the next 1 month in order to go forward on this issue.
And Charles, has he responded to you, Charles? Has the Menteri Besar Selangor said yes to this task force?
No, he has not responded yet. Just said wait for what he's going to say.
Okay, well, Charles, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Really appreciate your time. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll come back and explore more about this topic, so stay tuned to consider this.
Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Adat berteraskan budaya dan semangat di jiwa menjadi kesinambungan. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia. Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia. Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia. Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia.
Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about Malaysia's water security. This follows the supply disruption to 1.2 million consumer accounts in the Klang Valley over the past few days. Joining us on the line now, we have S. Piarapakaran. He's the president of the Association of Water and Energy Research Malaysia. Good evening, Piara. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Now, in reading the facts of the recent pollution of Sungai Gong, what stood out to you? What stood out the most to you in terms of institutional failures, either by the government at the federal level, or the state level, or at the municipal level, or even by agencies tasked with water management?
Well, it doesn't come as a surprise. I would believe by next week they'll forget about it until another incident takes place, and then they'll all be jumping on the bandwagon. And basically, they'll be repeating almost the same thing. And one of the worst things that we are looking at is that Sungai Selangor is supplying almost 60% of raw water to Klang Valley. And we do know that that's a very critical situation. And we are at a very low reserve margin operation in Klang Valley. Langatu is delayed. So if the authorities are actually taking this situation very lightly, I think they are just bringing shame to the nation. I mean, we have gone through independence. We are 63 years old. And, is it so bad to actually manage situations where, it should be done in a very technical manner?
Pierre, I understand what you're saying. You seem to be suggesting that there's no real barrier to actually maintaining a sophisticated modern water management system. But surely, the inertia of the various levels of government, federal or state, can be explained by something. What is it? Is it the cost? Is it that for the longest time Selangor and the federal government have been run by different governments and they've been at loggerheads? What exactly do you think, from an analytical point of view, is the blockage here?
Well, if you look at the cost of pollution occurring is actually higher than managing or preventing a pollution. So it is more on the enforcement and more on the work that need to be done at the ground. Like, for example, there are illegal factories, and which is your catchment area. Basically, you need to map out, you need to see who is there, who's posing risk. So how do you manage this? Do you shift them to another location, or do you provide them with assistance how to manage and continue to operate without giving risk to the catchment? So there are a lot of options available. Are they really doing it, or are they just coming out and when there's a crisis? And many of these amendments, we have heard about it. That many ministers have seen pass through, but I'm not seeing it. Having a light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, for me, Piara, one of the things that I was most concerned about was the fact that there was one single source, one factory who made this decision, and that impacted 1.2 million consumer accounts. Are we not diversifying our catchment areas or our water sources enough that one single source of pollution affects 1.2 million people?
Well, that goes back to the state government. Now, back in 2008, when the government changed between federal and state, we had people coming out and saying we have enough water. And I remember back in 2011, 2012, when we started to we did modeling, we raised the issue that there will be a water crisis, insufficient water supply. We need Langatu to come in to balance up the reserve, to have a better reserve margin. Now, all those, if you look at those statistics, those data, those information that some of them have released in the media, you will know that some of them were actually lying. Now we are in this situation because some of them have misled. So, and I don't think there's any point of us talking about it now. They're not going to admit, So, end of the day, they made wrong decision. Langatu did not come in. So if now Langatu is operating, I can tell you the reserve margin will be stress released by about 10 to 15%. So if Sungai Selangor is polluted, it may be impacting, based on the current 1+ million, maybe it's just 400-500 million people. And because when we do pipe network, we are also looking at interconnecting between zones. So when there is reserve margin at the Langatu supply regime, there will be interconnection to the Sungai Selangor supply region. So when there is a crisis, when there is an interconnection, we will further reduce the impact. That is the most important part of having reserve margin in a water supply system.
Okay, Piara, Piara, so at this point, that's all hypothetical. This is not what we have. So, some people also quite despondent about the inertia in government, whether the federal or the state level, are saying, well, maybe what the Selangor state government can do is to help encourage water harvesting by citizens. That, we could find other ways of dealing with the problem that might have government in it, might not have government in it. Are there other avenues when you consider the inertia in government?
Well, there are alternatives. Like, for example, when we look at rainwater harvesting, as you mentioned, we only harvest rainwater when there's rain, right? But then again, people get confused with rainwater harvesting generally because they feel you need to put up a very sophisticated system. I mean, my grandmother used to just put pail and basins to fetch rainwater, and that was rainwater harvesting those days. So you do not need a high-end technology. It's just that when you harvest this rainwater, they are also exposed to mosquito breeding, including some of those systems that was developed by some of the government agencies. I went to one school. They actually had a rainwater harvesting system connected from bottom tank to pump it to the usage of toilets in the school. But we found out that there's mosquitoes. So there's one outlet where it is open, and mosquitoes, they can actually, where it's the fresh water, they can fly through that particular hole. So there are risks on mosquito breeding if you do conventional rainwater harvesting. But those who have additional allocation, they may have some savings, they want to invest in a rainwater harvesting system, yes, that's possible. And I think some new housing developments are actually coming equipped with rainwater harvesting system. Maybe there are some government incentives for these developers, maybe they are not. So I think the government can look at reducing. The rainwater harvesting actually does not reduce the total water consumption, but we are basically supplementing it to reduce treated water consumption, but total consumption will be quite similar.
Piara, we have a minute left. I do want to ask you, just before we spoke to you, we spoke to Charles Santiago, former chairman of SPAN, and he said that Malaysians treat our rivers like a dumping ground, like a rubbish dump. What do you think we need to do first steps to reverse this?
Now, basically, if you look at the river system, all drainage leads to the river. And that river brings it and dumps it in the ocean because of dilution factor. That is how the drainage is designed. But in many countries, we do not, they do not directly pollute the river, basically because they have a better discharge standard. Now, we are actually still using archaic discharge standard where, if you studied 20, 30 years ago, the population density is low. Now the population density has increased. So we need to change it to pollution loading-based discharge standard, which can actually assist us to reduce the pollution impact. And in longer term, if this is done continuously, 10 to 20 years from now, even Klang River, maybe you can build a treatment plant in Puchong because the pollutants have gone and we have flushed them naturally through the 10 to 20 years period. And now the river is ready for us to use it as a water source. And we have proposed many of these things to the government. Now it's just time for them to move on and implement compared to doing cosmetic projects.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. I appreciate your time and your insights. That's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.